Good afternoon, everyone. If you happen to be in the same time zone as we are in Central Europe, and a warm welcome to today's Patient Engagement Open Forum webinar with the title, How Can Patient Engagement Foster Access Through Improved Affordability? So what we are going to talk about today in the next approximately 120 minutes is access and affordability of medicines, and especially how patients, patient organizations, patient advocates can be active and can contribute to access through improved affordability. My name is Tamás Berecki, and I will be your host for this webinar. I work with the European Patients Academy, EUPATI, as the content and courses coordinator. Some of you may already know me in this capacity, and I'm truly delighted to host this session again, just like the previous one. There's a couple of simple ground rules for you. Please, everybody mute yourselves during the webinar. You are muted when you join. If you would like to ask a question, then please do so by typing your question into the questions and answers box, which we will be monitoring. Or you can also raise your hand, and if time permits, then we can give you the floor. We have a quite dense agenda for today, so we may not be able to reply to all the questions that you raise. We also would like to ensure that all our speakers, and we have an excellent panel for today, can have their say. So there's the questions and answers box. Please use that. Mute yourselves. There might be certain issues that are super interesting but not so relevant for today's webinar. That's what we describe as a jellyfish moment or as a jellyfish thought. We will park those inputs and those questions for a later discussion, or maybe for a discussion by email. And of course, it would be highly appreciated if you could please mute your cell phones so that there's no background noise during the webinar. Our distinguished speaker panel today consists of the following people: Tracy Swan from the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition and a number of other organizations. Tracy has been working as a treatment and access advocate in patient communities in HIV, tuberculosis, and viral hepatitis for several years. She comes from the US but lives in Europe now, so knows both sides of the Atlantic and has been working very intensely in this area for a number of years. Dermot McDonald from Just Treatment, who represents a patient organization, also very active in access and affordability topics, who will speak about how patient organizations specifically can get involved in this discussion. Professor Zoltán Kaló from Budapest, Hungary, who works at the Center for Health Technology Assessment at the Semmelweis University. The Semmelweis University is a medical university. And Professor Kaló has been active in pharmacoeconomics and also the social collaterals of medicines research and development for a number of years, and has been working as a professor but also as a researcher in this field. And also we have Dr. Claire Haig from Janssen, who will be speaking about the industry perspective of access and affordability. But Dr. Haig is also a researcher herself, has been active in this field and publishing about access and affordability for quite a while. And I will be hosting this webinar from the European Patients Academy, and also with a bunch of other organizations where I'm also involved. Amongst others, I've also been working in access, pricing, and affordability for the last 6 or 7 years as a patient activist, a patient advocate. Let's look quickly at the agenda. So we have a short introduction, as you can see. Then we will have 2 statements from our panelists, from Tracy and Claire. Then we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. Then another statement from our panelists. It will be Dermot and Zoltan speaking. Then a longer session for questions and answers and discussion. And at the end, we will try to summarize what the key takeaway messages of today's session are. Meanwhile, I encourage you to please raise your questions and type them into the questions and answers box. The Patient Engagement Open Forum is a series of virtual events in the second half of 2020. All of us in the Paradigm Project at EUPATI and also with PFMD, Patient-Focused Medicines Development, have been working together in a multi-stakeholder context in order to import the practical aspects, the doing into the theory of patient engagement. We also want to provide a holistic perspective of patient engagement and describe the landscape of all actors, and also we want to motivate for more collaboration, co-creation especially, and also we try to overcome this siloed nature, the fragmentation of patient engagement that is very much there in the current landscape. Access and affordability, and of course, this also includes to some extent pricing, are a new topic for us, but something that's been very intensively debated in patient communities for the last couple of years. And so we thought it's time for us to immerse ourselves in this conversation and look at what can be done, what should be done, and where things stand. I encourage you to check out the Patient Engagement Open Forum website, where you find the detailed program and also the recordings of the past events of the PEOF with all the slide decks and the presentations, the webinars provided there for your interest. So without further delay, I would like to ask Tracy to start with her presentation. And as agreed, please, Tracy, let me know when you want me to advance your slides.
Thank you so much, Tomas. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Great. Well, I want to thank EUPATI for inviting me and organizing this webinar, and to thank Dr. Andrew Hill for sharing his slides, and also thank my co-presenters today. So as Tomas told you, I've been working on access to medicines and also analyzing research and drug development processes, and doing direct education with different patient and activist communities on HIV, hepatitis C, and TB for decades, including with Treatment Action Group, HEP Coalition, and the MSF Access Campaign, and the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition. So today I'm going to be using some examples from hepatitis C drug development to talk about drug development, drug productions cost, and drug pricing. And I'm going to be using two World Health Organization recommended direct-acting antiviral drugs that can cure hepatitis C, called declatosphere and sofosbuvir. And these drugs were a huge breakthrough when they came out. They can cure hep C in just 12 weeks of once daily pills, but they weren't cheap. And declatosphere, as you can see on this slide, was launched at a price for 12 weeks in the US that was higher than a similar amount of diamonds, which really gives you cause to think, you know, how much does it really cost to bring a drug to market if this is, you know, what something is initially launched at? And the answer is we don't really know. The pharmaceutical industry is not transparent about what they spend, and the cost of failed drugs is included in the cost of drugs that make it to market. This is called opportunity cost. So you think if every for-profit business in the world charged us for every employee that didn't perform well and every decision that cost them money, we'd never be able to actually afford anything. Next slide, please. So we do have some estimates of what it costs to bring a drug to market, and they're comprised differently. One study included the cost of failed trials, and it estimated that it cost a median of $985 million to bring a drug per market. But then we have another study that included the post-approval research and development costs, which may be a better metric. And that came to $2,870 million per drug. So this is really what we know. And as far as declatosphere, the one that was launched at a higher price than diamonds, we really don't know what it costs to develop. But we actually know quite a bit about what it costs to develop sofosbuvir. Next slide, please. And the reason why we know this is because Gilead bought an entire pharmaceutical company, Pharmasset, solely to get sofosbuvir, which was in phase 2 trials at the time and showed amazing promise as a Hep C treatment. And they spent $11 billion to buy the company. Okay, but again, it was in phase 2. So, Gilead still had to get it across the finish line to phase 3. And I did some looking around, and the average phase 3 trial costs about $19 million. Gilead did 4 of them to get sofosbuvir approved. There were less than 2,000 people in these trials. But, instead of saying 80 million, let's err on the high end and say 200 million, because there were some investigator-initiated studies and post-marketing commitments. Okay, so this revenue that Gilead obtained for sofosbuvir from 2013, it was introduced in December initially, to the end of 2017, was $31.5 billion. Now, Gilead also made fixed dose combinations with their other Hep C drugs, including sofosbuvir. This figure does not include that. This is for this one drug alone. That, the development costs were about $11.2 billion. And, this drug really generated some shock waves in the US because it was launched at $1,000 per pill or $84,000 for a 12-week treatment course. And it needed to be used with other medicines. So it was quite expensive. Next slide, please. So what does it actually cost to make sofosbuvir? And this is an estimate from Andrew Hill and his colleagues at the University of Liverpool, where they look at the cost of the active pharmaceutical ingredient, formulation costs, other ingredients, packaging, profit margin, even the tax on profit. Now, this has gone down as the world has achieved more economies of scale with sofosbuvir. But you can see the final generic price for a 12-week treatment course is $27.65. Next slide, please. What about declatosphere? Well, we don't know how much it costs to develop. We do know how much it costs to generically mass produce declatosphere profitably. And the final generic price for declatosphere is just $4.38 for an entire 12-week treatment course. Okay, so there you have a total of $33 for a 12-week course of treatment with 2 once-daily oral drugs that can cure people from hepatitis C virus. Next slide, please. But what are the prices? Well, the answer is it really depends on what part of the country you live in. Now, I'm originally from the United States, which we're not known as being good bargain hunters for pharmaceutical products, as you can see with the $142,000 price tag. But if you look at other countries, you can see the prices are a lot lower. But Egypt is one of the lower price countries because they actually rejected the patents on each of these drugs, saying that they lack novelty and inventive step. So there are many pathways to affordability, but really the point I want to make is this relationship between development cost and price is not very clear. And, you know, I want to be very clear also that I'm in no way saying the pharmaceutical industry shouldn't profit. Of course they should. I have type 1 diabetes. My life depends on insulin. I'll be dead in a week without it. And there are many people that rely on their products. But I think the lack of transparency really needs to be addressed so people know exactly why they're paying what they're paying for something. And, you know, not just from pharmaceutical companies, from governments as well, like what's the whole pricing structure. Some countries have done a better job of this than others, which is why you see so much variability in the pricing. Now, the reason why sofosbuvir and declatosphere are more relevant than ever is there have been some preliminary trials in Iran based on preclinical activity of especially declatosphere, but also a little bit sofosbuvir in COVID-19. And there have been 3 small trials in Iran that found a benefit with survival and with recovery time. And this might turn out to be a very promising therapy for COVID-19. Now, there are several ongoing trials in different countries. The results where we'll really have a much better idea, because these are randomized controlled trials and larger. They're due in October. So we might actually have a combination antiviral therapy for COVID-19. And, you know, you don't need 12 weeks. You only need about 14 days of treatment. And that's projected to be at a generic cost of $5 per person per treatment course. So I know I sort of buried the lead on the sofosbuvir declatosphere story, but there's such a good case in point for what we go in knowing about prices, what we don't know, and just the variability and often how far they are from the production cost. And you know, how we're not really clear about how development should be factored in since it's not described transparently. And I'm happy to take questions afterwards. And I thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tracy, very much. I think that one very interesting question, which I will ask all of you on the panel, will be what is it that patient communities can do to promote this conversation and to come to some meaningful results. But before we go there, I would like to ask Claire, Dr. Haig, to talk about the industry perspective before we come. And for this, I will need to share your slides before we come to the discussion. And just 1 second before I launch your slides here. Here you go, Claire. And once again, you should let me know. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Is it working now?
Yes, I can see the slides. If you could just put them on
Excellent.
large screen, that would be perfect. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Claire Haig, and I am the head of the market access team for hematology at Janssen. I just wanted to, if we can get my slides up.
Yes, I'm sorry. Here you go. Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, so if we can go on to the next slide. So my presentation today will address the topic of access and affordability from a pharmaceutical company perspective, based on my experience at Janssen, and I will cover 2 topics. First, how we navigate access challenges in Europe, and second, what and how can we do to work together to do more for patients. So on the next slide, I want to start by saying that innovative medicines have made a significant contribution to addressing many health challenges faced by patients and healthcare systems. playing an important role in saving and extending lives and improving the quality of life of patients and carers. And in the case of multiple myeloma, the 5-year survival rates have increased more than 4 times faster than other cancers, for example, and this has been thought to be attributed to the large number of treatments approved in the past 20 years. Next slide, please. So whilst the pharmaceutical industry is delivering more and more innovative medicines and vaccines, we recognise that for patients and healthcare systems, that to benefit, healthcare must be affordable now and sustainable in the future. And healthcare spend is often considered in cost terms. It's all focused on, expenditure. But the truth is it's an investment in achieving good health and well-being. And actually spending on medicines accounts for only 1/5 of the total healthcare expenditure in Europe. In some cases, medicines can also offset the cost of subsequent treatments and avoid hospitalizations and need for subsequent treatments. And I think that it's really important. It's not just about spend, it's about value for money and the outcomes that we observe and achieve from patient care. But the key question remains is how to ensure that patients get access to the right treatment at the right time, such that they are able to reap the benefits of innovation. But at the same time, we need to meet the needs of payers in helping them manage their limited budgets. So on the next slide, what I want to take you through today is an explanation in terms of how we do things at Janssen. Okay. So on the next slide, what I want to start by saying is that the first part of us to secure reimbursement of our innovative cancer medicines and any of our medicines, to be fair, is to engage with all stakeholders to first understand what they need in order to inform their decisions. So from a patient perspective, it could be a dialogue around better understanding the limitations of current treatments and what they would like to see from a new therapy, whether it be increased efficacy, improved safety, better quality of life, convenience and symptom palliation. So to really understand the unmet need from their perspective. And then we also engage with payers early in development. They may be keen on seeing improvements in overall survival, reductions in hospitalizations, maybe a preference for an oral versus IV therapy. And then we go about developing an evidence package that can demonstrate a treatment's ability to meet these needs, at the same time as seeking scientific advice from regulators and payers to ensure that what we're developing will be successfully approved and reimbursed once the clinical trials have been completed. So on the next slide, what I want to do is to share with you, how Janssen price their medicines. And, this is all on our website. The link is at the bottom of the page on the slide. So in terms of how we price our medicines, we're guided by 3 principles. First, we consider the value that the medicine brings to a patient, prescriber, HTA agency and payer from a local country perspective. In Europe, decisions on pricing and reimbursement are made at the national level, and each country determines price via its own evaluation processes, because each country has a different healthcare budget, as well as different pricing and reimbursement systems and legal guidelines. So on the next slide, I wanted to explain that when we propose our price to pricing authorities, our primary objective is to ensure that patients can access our medicines whilst providing a fair return to the company for the investment made in bringing a new medicine to the market, and also safeguarding investment in research for other innovations. And I think it's important to note that it's not only the clinical trials that we invest in. We have to generate a whole package of evidence outside of the clinical trials to secure reimbursement of our medicines, and they may include real-world evidence, patient preference studies, health economic models, budget impact models. It's not just the clinical trial that we focus on. And in Europe, these negotiations that we make are with public authorities and often include a systematic clinical and cost effectiveness assessment comparing the new treatment to existing treatments. And this is often referred to as health technology assessment. And in countries where that use HTA, either the manufacturer sets the drug price and the HTA agencies use that price to assess value, or the HTA itself determines value and then sets the price at which the health system will reimburse. So most countries also use benchmarking or referencing that determines their prices, which is referred to as international reference pricing, which is where a pricing method is based on the average price of a given therapy in other countries, as well as therapeutic references, where they set price relative to baskets of theoretically or therapeutically similar products. On the next slide, what I wanted to do is finally get to the third point around our pricing. Is although the product profile and the market dynamics will dictate our pricing and access strategy, we often make our medicines available at lower prices than the price that's made available in the public domain, which are confidential prices. We refer to this as offering a managed entry agreement. And these agreements can take various different forms. They can be a simple discount, or they can be, we can capture data that enables an outcomes-based scheme, where we capture the outcomes of patients in real life and we look at how the drug performs if there's uncertainty in the evidence package. And managed entry agreements like these are very common in many EU member states, and they provide a win-win solution to enabling broader access or earlier access to new drugs, whilst maintaining control on the drug spend. And my next slide talks about equity. And one of the things that I think is important is that we do adjust our prices to the income of different countries. And this is called equity-based tier pricing. As I said, where higher net prices are charged in countries with higher incomes and lower net prices in lower income countries. And obviously going on to my next slide, I think I wanted to illustrate on my next slide some of the examples of managed entry agreements that we've used across Europe in multiple myeloma, where we've got access to patients and reimbursement. So one is that we've looked at coverage with evidence development schemes, and that's where we collect data on the drug performance in real life. And if the drug doesn't perform as expected, we give the payers a rebate, a discount. Or, for example, we've got rebates for patients, as I said at the bottom, that respond or don't respond or progress earlier than expected. And these kinds of agreements really give us the flexibility to find solutions to some of the challenges. So if I come on to the challenges on the next slide, I think that the access challenges that we see in the market do require new thinking, and we need to involve patients in the debate. And I think focusing on evidence generation alone, although it's something that we do every day, is not sufficient for access. We need a consistently strong voice in the clinical development of our products, as well as in HTA reimbursement decisions. And I think the important point is that we need to work together to develop appropriate pricing frameworks that offer more flexibility. And I think on the next slide, I think this really talks to the importance of collaboration and the question of how we can work together to do more for patients. So on my next slide, very quickly, we're constantly exploring ways to overcome reimbursement challenges in order to enable faster access. Our options in red are not options that we support, for example, delaying submissions until we get statistically significant overall survival data. We're waiting forever. But what we do is we try and look at intermediate surrogate endpoints, patient-reported outcomes. We've spoken a lot about innovative managed entry schemes, but I think the key thing is about the partnerships, working collaboratively with HTA agencies and all stakeholders to look at, how we can do better and how we can speed things up. I think on my next slide, I think one of the things that I think is a key enabler is also acceptance, greater acceptance of managed entry agreements. There's a lot of literature out there looking at all of these different possibilities to get access, to address the affordability question, but often not many examples of how this has been implemented in practice. So very quickly on my next slide, I think in conclusion, I think engagement and collaboration with all stakeholders is critical. Patients, doctors and nurses, regulators, HTA agencies and payers. And I think that on my final slide, to ensure that we represent the patient voice, which is what we're here to talk about today, I think we need to be doing more around generating continuous insights from patients on their disease and treatment, working more collaboratively on patient evidence strategies, and finally forging much closer collaborations and partnerships with patients and advocacy groups, really to co-develop solutions for access and make sure that we represent the patient's experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. That was very interesting, especially from the perspective that it shows how complex this field actually is. In contrast with what Tracy was talking about, which already showed the complexity, and then you brought in a number of additional very interesting perspectives. The question remains how we can achieve this closer cooperation, also not just in the science of medicine's development and research, but also in the science and practice of access and affordability. We have a couple of minutes now for questions and answers and discussion, as it says in the agenda, and then we will move on with the presentations or statements from our panelists. Of course, you're very welcome to ask from each other as well as panelists. However, I have one question already in the questions and answers box, which I will raise to you, and I think it goes basically to all of you, but probably mostly to Claire. And the question goes, how about the cost of the many compounds which were studied and caused costs before coming to the market and ended up in not sufficient results to be launched? Should these also be considered in the evaluation or in the equation when it comes to setting the price of the medicine or the cost?
So the cost of failure is a really interesting one, and I think that one of the things that you'll learn if you come into contact with people in the pharmaceutical industry is that they employ now health economists in the disease area strategy teams and the early product development scheme. So when you have assets in phase 1 or phase 2, to constantly remind them of what value looks like. So what payers and patients will value from a new treatment. And what this information and guidance gives an organisation is it enables us to de-risk. So, for example, what it does is it sets a threshold for what success looks like early in order to kill products that look low value, that are not going to generate any value to anybody, and that we get rid of these assets earlier. And a good example of that is from AstraZeneca, where I worked for 6 years, where they also completely revolutionised their R&D model to improve success in the pipeline, to reduce the spend on unsuccessful assets. And they did this in a number of ways, but one of which was to install health economists early in the R&D development cycle. And that, I think, will contribute significantly to alleviating the cost of failure being carried over into the cost of success. Okay, so I think that there are a number of steps that people are taking in the pharmaceutical industry to reduce the cost of failure and failure, in its entirety. No longer will you see a product in phase 3 that shouldn't be there, i.e., you'll see that there's a decline, or there should be a decline in the number of phase 3 failures for that reason. It's a great question, and I can understand why people would be concerned about that, but I've seen a massive change, more particularly over the last 5 to 8 years.
Right. I think that before I come to the next question, which was typed into the Q&A box, I think this also calls the attention to something that's been going on as a discussion in the background for quite a while, and you will remember that we were also mentioning this in the preparation briefing to this particular session today, which is the distinction, or the need for a distinction, between cost, price, and value. So what are these three domains that we probably need to define better or clearer also for the patient community? What's your take on this? And this question goes to all panelists before I come back to another question that's in the box from the audience.
So I think it's very important to make clear that the price of medicines is based on the value that they should be offering to patients. It should be in some ways not so connected to the costs it took to manufacture the treatment. But there's a lot of intellectual property and investment that goes into identifying innovation, right? It doesn't happen overnight. So I would say that the price of a med should always reflect the value it brings to patients relative to other treatments that are out there. And you can measure value in different ways, depending on what you value as an individual. But what we do know in cancer is that patients value symptom palliation, quality of life, and overall survival benefits. any treatment that doesn't deliver on those three things without significant toxicity has no value. I also think that we have patents, which are a period of time where we can recoup the return on investment and generate sufficient profit to reinvest into R&D. After that time, generics come in. So that's how I see value. It's very much from a, it's quite personal. It's quite, you know, value to a payer might be different than value from a doctor's perspective, might be different from value from a patient perspective. And that's why we need a multi-stakeholder discussion around value.
Can I contribute to this issue? Because
absolutely.
Let me highlight some other perspectives. First of all, the relationship between costs and value and price. And for pharmaceuticals, the cost is always global, or the majority of the cost, like development cost and production cost, is a global factor, while the value and the price is always local. So the problem is that even if we know what is the development cost, what is the production cost, we will never have a kind of good conclusion on how the price should change across countries and what is the value across countries. So it's an important information to know, and from that point of view, I fully agree with Tracy that we should know and we should have more clarity on how much the costs are. But I can guarantee that globally there would be a disagreement on how this should be translated into local prices, partly because those who are more affluent countries, well, just look at the recent initiatives, external price referencing, may not want to pay higher prices for the same drug compared to lower income countries. So that's the reason why actually it would be very difficult to draw a conclusion on the magic formula. But let me just come back why the development cost is an important issue. It's because actually we see a very interesting trend recently that pharma companies turn to those areas where actually the development costs are somewhat less compared to other therapeutic areas, and the failure rates are smaller. How they can do that? In certain areas, for example, there are public incentives, and you can potentially register a drug without phase 3 trial, so that your drug cannot fail in phase 3. So you can register the drug based on a single arm study, based on phase 2 results. So that's the reason why actually even including the cost of failures, the cost of developing an orphan drug is just 1/4, 26% of the cost of developing a drug in other diseases. Or the cost of developing an oncology drug is also like 50%, partly because actually the sample size in a trial for late-stage cancer, the absolute risk is very high. So you don't need to recruit as many patients in an oncology study compared to a cardiovascular study, compared to a diabetes study. So that's the reason why actually many companies currently pay much more attention to disease areas where the cost of development is less. So while I agree that there are certain factors which increases the cost of development in general, but companies now turn into these areas where, due to public incentives, due to some other reasons, due to the very high absolute risks, the trials are smaller, and you have a chance to register your drug based on a phase 3 study with huge uncertainties. And so if we argue that the pharmaceutical prices are increasing because of the increase in development costs, actually this is not true. Partly because in these areas, like in orphan drugs, in oncology, the cost of developing a drug is less than in other areas. So that's the reason why it's important to know how much, to have more transparency on the development cost, and not because we can directly translate this knowledge into what should be the fair price drugs. Because I agree with Claire in that the value-based price is very different across different jurisdictions. So we cannot directly translate the global data into a kind of local information on value and costs.
Right, thank you, Zoltan. You have just added to the complexity tremendously much. But that should not discourage us. Actually, the next question, which goes to Claire, asks about the net profit of Janssen income before taxes in the last years and how that compares to other companies. But I think this is information that's available on your website, right? So we don't need to go into such financial details. Am I right?
That's right. I think there should be the company accounts online that will have all of that information.
All right, and then there are two more. There are two more questions right now. One of them I would like to park for the second questions and answers block because it seems to be more complex. However, the other one asks this: when developing and implementing local initiatives to approach patients across different geographies and following an equitable pricing approach, what is the most relevant success factor considered? Who wants to take this one?
I think I'll just start by saying that you need to plan early. So I think the key success factor is that the manufacturer engages with the national payers early, before the drug comes to market, and agrees ahead of time what kind of access strategy they're going to employ. So I think that is really important, and also, you know, to work in partnership with patient advocates to make them aware that the new product's coming, and to, you know, make sure that, again, we've got the right evidence package. So I would say early engagement is one of the critical success factors.
I think that's a tool, and this is not a success factor. The success factor is that if we assume that the prevalence of the disease is the same across different countries, the utilization per 100,000 patients is the equity in access is the success factor. So if we see that in poorer countries there is no lower access to medicines, for me that's the success factor. The early engagement and so on. These are all tools, but these are not success factors or indicators of success.
Mm-hmm. Tracy or Dermot, your take on this perhaps, or you pass on this perhaps?
No, I think increasing people's knowledge about the access options that they have, which may be outside of what has been discussed so far, such as the relationships that patient groups have with the patent office and with people in the government to say, you know, do we need to issue a compulsory license? Do we have need for this product? Is it unaffordable? Are we offered a voluntary license? What are all the access tools in our toolbox? And what do we need to use? I think also just going back to the whole development, you know, who was in the trials? Were the medicines studied in people with the most urgent needs? Sometimes trials don't include people who are more ill because it makes a drug not look as effective as in people with an earlier stage of the illness. Or, you know, what we're seeing with COVID right now, we really need trials and people are at highest risk of severe outcomes and death, not like just young, healthy people, although of course they matter too. And I think really having much more information about how the drug in question was developed, what the benefits are, and what the access options are on the table, and multi-stakeholder dialogues are really, really important that are inclusive of what Claire has mentioned, but much broader.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just to quickly add, if you can hear me, Thomas, is to say, yes, I think it's really, thanks. Thanks all for the contributions as well so far. I think what's really important, and Tracy hinted at this a little bit, is to think about, and I'll maybe speak about this a bit more when I present, is to think about the challenges around access and affordability in their totality. And I think often if patients are involved just at the point of health technology assessment or reimbursement decision making, we've kind of missed the boat a little bit, because lots of the decisions that are taken around whether a drug is affordable or priced at a level that a country health system can access happens way up the food chain, and at the point where a health technology assessment authority or other relevant authority is making a decision on a medicine, in a sense, the big drivers of unaffordability or lack of affordability have already played out in the price that medicine is coming to the market at. And so I think for patients to be effective in how we engage in this work, we need to be engaging in a much broader sense across the whole pharmaceutical industry and drug development process.
Thank you, Dermot. That's music to my ears, actually, because we at EUPATI have always been preaching early engagement, primarily in research and development science. But of course, I understand from what you folks are saying that early engagement should probably also apply to this type of, if you like, more policy decisions and processes. Would you feel comfortable, Dermot, continuing with your presentation then, because we come to the next block of statements from you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tomas, and thanks to the other panelists, and thanks everybody for joining. Tomas, you're in control of my slides, so let's see.
Yes.
Let's see how well we coordinate ourselves. I'll start with just on this slide to say a little bit about myself. I'm Dermot. I've worked for over a decade on access to medicines issues, including a lot of work around global HIV and AIDS. And 3 years ago, established Just Treatment. You can move the slide on, where a patient-led organization focused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a second. I'm sorry. I got into
I think you need to enter present mode,
here. Yeah, that's what I missed. So there you go.
Well, it's nice that I'm not the one struggling with the technology. So I'll keep talking while we fiddle. I think you need to click present. I'm not sure.
I did. Why isn't it presenting? Hold on. It's coming
that
up
looks
now.
like something is happening.
Yep, got it.
You can. I don't know if you're able to drag the size of that window. There we go. Okay. So I was saying, yeah, we're a patient-led organization. We have been going for about 3 years now. Most of the work that we've done up until this year has been focused on challenges where NHS patients in the UK have been denied access to effective medicines because of the high price. And so we organize with them, not just to kind of demand that more money is spent on medicines by the health service, because I think the more money you spend, the higher the prices will get, but actually to look at some of the fundamental drivers of those high prices. And if you move the slide on, one of the campaigns we've been involved in the last 12 months was one around access to the cystic fibrosis drug, or Orkambi. This was a drug which was developed with a huge amount of public investment and was set at a price that was judged to be way above what was cost effective for the health service in the UK. And we engaged in that process by not just advocating through the kind of health technology assessment process or NICE, but actually looking at some of the fundamental factors which allowed the price to be set at a level that meant patients' lives were being held to ransom in the way that they were for 4 years in the end. So if you move the slide along, I'll talk a little bit more about the exact subject of the topic today. So at a very general level, I think it's good to reflect very briefly, and this will be an insufficient summary of what patient engagement is supposed to achieve, but and others on the call will probably have much more sophisticated understandings. But I think it's about ensuring that we get good quality medicines and we that have a valuable impact on patient lives and outcomes at a price that's affordable for them as individuals if they're in a circumstance where they're having to pay out of pocket, or for the health system more generally. I think there are a number of things which influence the access challenges. The three which were floated as the potential ways to frame the discussion today were cost, price, and value. I would argue that actually, in effect, value is a little bit of a distraction from the core drivers of high prices and affordability and access. I think we heard from the pharmaceutical industry for many years that the reason for high prices was to recoup the cost of R&D and to cover the risks that they were taking. But as we've learned more about the truth of the cost of developing medicines, even though there's still a lot that we don't know, the arguments that have been used to justify high prices by the industry have started to shift, including the idea of value-based pricing. And Jack Scannell, who's a health economist and a former financier, has said that the concept of value-based pricing originated in luxury goods, handbags and watches and the like, and it's wholly inappropriate to use that kind of pricing tool on essential products like medicines, which can save and change lives. You know, if we try to apply that in other areas of healthcare, I have a daughter who's coming up for her first birthday. What value did I place on the work of the midwife who helped my wife bring our daughter into the world? Should we pay those midwives according to that value? I think if you start to apply the tools that the pharmaceutical industry are advocating for to justify their prices across the rest of the healthcare system, we suddenly realize we would be spending totally unaffordable amounts of money across the whole of health, not just on our medicines. You know, we don't negotiate the fee for putting out our house fire when the fire brigade show up. There are better ways to do this, and we need to understand. And so if you move the slide on, we need to understand the costs of developing these medicines. Sorry, I was the previous slide, I was just looking at my notes when you talked. So if you could move it back one, Tomas, if that's not too complicated. I think we need to set aside the concept of value in how we understand these issues, because I think the drivers of this around cost and price actually are undermined and clouded in a sense by value, because I think, as Professor Zoltan has said already, that is quite a subjective subject area that changes considerably from context to context, and it makes it very difficult for us to be accurate in appropriating or appraising the value of any individual product. Yeah, bear with me one second. So I would say as well, I think lots of people within patient groups and patient organizations have latched on to the concept of value because it gives us a stake in some of the discussions around decision making on access to medicines when they're going through the HTA process. But I would argue that intervention at that point in the kind of discussion around whether or not a drug should be approved for use at the price that the company is charging often fails patients because it misses the core drivers preventing access. It can often harm health systems and often helps the pharmaceutical industry. So if we move the slide on a little bit, I would argue that actually some of the main factors that influence the price of a medicine rest with the pharmaceutical industry and the model of policy regulation, which they've been spending a huge amount of money on to influence. Companies will seek to maximize profits for their shareholders. They will often, and in almost every case, try to secure a price that they think will maximize their profit in any one individual market. This is not a controversial statement. It's baked into the system that we've got at the moment. But there are things which influence the relative power that they have to charge the prices that they're seeking to charge. So intellectual property rights and other monopoly protections, R&D incentives, tax and rebate and tax credits, price control mechanisms that happen at an individual level. Actually, the financialization of the pharmaceutical industry is playing a significant role in the pricing that we're seeing of medicines. International trade agreements and public perception and reputation risk management. So to flag a couple of those in particular, you know, I would say, first of all, Claire didn't mention the easiest means that they have of overcoming the access challenges that they engage with is for her company and other companies to drop the prices that they're demanding for their medicines. But there are drivers which are preventing them from doing that. And some of that is to do with financialization. So if we see one example around the level of buybacks. So companies using their revenue not to invest in R&D and development of new medicines, but actually to inflate the share price and to distribute revenue to their shareholders. One example, studies done recently from 2009 to 2018, i.e. the period when insulin prices saw their sharpest increase in the US, the three largest insulin manufacturers distributed a total of $122 billion to their shareholders. Now, that's something that we need to be engaging with as patient groups to figure out, is that the where we want the money that we're spending on medicines to go to? And if we are going to reduce the prices of medicines, we need to be able to figure out whether we can have an impact on those kinds of trends. I would also say as well, Gilead, which is the manufacturer of some of the medicines that Tracy was talking about earlier, the US Senate requisitioned some of their internal documents which were related to the price decisions that they made on the medicines that are being provided for hepatitis C. And they had an internal discussion and a chart which clearly laid out the level of risk and public pushback and the risk of public government intervention depending on the level of price that they set for the medicine. It was nothing to do with the costs. It was nothing to do with the value to patients. It was about the price that they felt that they could get away with the minimal amount of negative consequences for their company. And what we're seeing as well is that kind of US style pricing challenge being imported into other countries through trade agreements. So Janssen are a member of PhRMA, which is the trade body in the US, who've been advocating strongly for the US government through trade agreements, including current negotiations with the UK, to remove the kind of price controls that national health systems have to keep these kind of high prices under control. So if we are only intervening at that HTA level, we're missing a huge amount of the opportunities that exist out there to truly influence the pricing of medicines. And so if we move this slide on, I would argue as well that there is a risk inherent in engaging in that level in a way that actually feeds more problematic outcomes for patients in general. We do see that some patient organizations take money from pharmaceutical company cash, and that then is those same patient groups are involved in decision-making processes around whether or not medicine should be approved. That's a conflict of interest that I think we as patients, if we saw it in other areas, we would be outraged at that, and we'd ask questions about whether or not that was influencing the outcomes. Now, that's not to say that I am critical of those patient organizations for what they're doing, and I'm sure what they're trying to engage in is a way of securing their financial future. But I think we need to be really careful that we don't inadvertently worsen the situation that we find ourselves in with creeping ever upwards prices and challenges of access, because we know that the pharmaceutical industry uses that kind of intervention to secure drug approval. Jeff Leiden, who's the CEO of Vertex, talked to his financial investors about the successes they were having where politicians were able to overrule HTA decisions based on the public debate driven by patient groups. And we see the consequences that are often the money that's there for one drug means that there isn't money there for other patient groups. And so I think we need to think more collectively about how we work together in solidarity across different drug and disease areas with other patients to ensure that we engage in a way that increases the chances, if you move the slide on, of affordability and access for all patients, not just the ones that are fighting for the specific individual drug that's being reviewed under HTA. And if we move again, I would argue that what that requires is for us to think more holistically about how we intervene in areas that potentially challenge some of those key drivers of high prices. For example, the monopolies, and making sure this is Christina and Lewis, who are two of the Lewis is one of the Orkambi patients who now has access to the drug after the success of our campaign last year. They challenged the monopoly by saying, listen, whenever a drug is not available because the price is too high, we shouldn't put the lives of patients at risk. We should put the monopolies of the drug companies at risk. And those are the kind of things that cut to the core of the problems we're seeing at the moment. If you move the slide on, I think another thing that patients need to do is to explore ways of demonstrating that the rules of the game, these bigger drivers of the kind of the paradigms under which access is determined, can be challenged. So we supported the use of importation of drugs from a part of the world where the medicine was not under patent in order to demonstrate that it's simply regulatory processes which are preventing patients from getting access. And my final slide beyond my thank you is to say that I think patient groups also need to think about how we demand a better innovation model, because this problem with the innovation model at the moment, with high prices resulting from monopolies, isn't just about lack of access to the medicines that we get. It often is delivering poor levels of medical innovation for patients and not giving us the kinds of improved health outcomes that we could get. And that can be seen in some of the evidence around the quality of cancer drugs that have been approved over the last between 2009 and 2013 in Europe, where over 50% didn't have the two things that are most important to patients. They didn't improve the quality of life, and they didn't extend the length of life, or there wasn't sufficient evidence to prove that. So I think that's a real challenge that we can lay as patients in the door of the pharmaceutical industry. Can we do better? Can we get this more affordably? And can we get it where the quality of innovation is better than it is at the moment? And if you move the slide on, it's that's the end of my my presentation, and I say thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Dermot. That was fascinating. Thank you so much for your input. And I think that you've touched on a number of very sensitive points and very important ones. The questions and answers box is boiling over. That's cool. Please keep them coming. And also because EUPATI is one of those organizations that's partly financed by the pharmaceutical industry, has always been for the last 8 years. Even though we hope we found the right structure or mechanism for retaining our independence and the unbiased nature of the information that we provide. However, it took a lot of effort. And with this, and before we plunge into the questions, I would like to ask Zoltán to also make his statement, and then we can engage in the discussion. And I'm coming to your slides now. 1 second. That's you. Zoltán, you take it away.
Thank you very much, and I very much appreciate your invitation to this important debate. Certainly, I would like to keep my kind of academic limit, so I believe in data and science, and try not to be subjective with my statements. I'm an economist, a health economist, and to be honest, until I don't know better models for developing new drugs, certainly there is a room for improvement here, but my concern is that we need to make sure that those who make the investment get the reward, even if we turn the entire model of drug development to public, still remains, because if one country makes the movement and all others free ride on the single country, the country would like to get their reward. And that's the reason why it's very difficult to do a business model without actually monopolies. And if we go ahead with the next slide, I try to raise some evidence gaps in the current business model. The first question is how much we know about patient access. And just when preparing for this statement, I received an important document about issued by FPA about the time to reimbursement. Time to reimbursement is a very controversial issue, I believe, first of all, because in many countries, patients can get access to therapies without the therapies available on the reimbursement, at least on a named patient basis. So it's not a good indicator. Second, actually, even after reimbursement, there are huge differences in the utilization of patients. So in lower income countries, drugs can be reimbursed, but only VIP patients can get access to it, and the volume, the utilization is significantly less. So time to reimbursement is a very documented phenomenon, but for me it's less important. The question is that if what happens with the access barriers after reimbursement, and in my opinion that's a much more important barrier to patients, but very poorly documented, partly because those who make documents about such inequity are usually coming from the rich countries and don't know what is the situation in the poorer countries. So for me, there is a huge information gap, evidence gap about access barriers after reimbursement. The next is about the value judgment, and I somewhat disagree with the conclusion on value, because I believe value is very important in determining whether the price is fair or not. I'm a health economist, so I'm confident that I've got obviously not 100% bulletproof approach to tell whether a drug is good value for money, but in many countries we've got a good conclusion on it, and I believe that we should approach the fairness of the price from the value perspective. And as a consequence, I really would like to see justifications about the price in different jurisdictions, so increased transparency and consistency about the policy decisions and use of HTA, health technology assessment, in different jurisdictions. And I see it in some countries, but I don't see it in other countries. And to be honest, if we make a value-based pricing with the traditional value judgment, many drugs, the high-cost therapies, won't be cost-effective even in higher income countries. So if you use just the cost per quality ratio with the traditional thresholds, it creates potential access barriers for orphan drugs and for very high cost therapies. But actually, what is cost-effective in a high-income country won't be cost-effective in a lower-income country, and because of the external price referencing, pharma companies cannot reduce their drug prices in lower income markets. So if we implement very strict cost effectiveness thresholds in lower income countries, then it can be perceived as an access barrier. So that's the reason why actually there are some global initiatives to extend the value frameworks in the value judgment of new health technologies, which would allow higher prices, more components in the value judgment in very special areas, which would definitely increase the patient access to these very high cost therapies. But if we spend too much on high cost therapies, we won't have money left or budget left for low cost therapies. So there is always a trade-off. So overall, I don't know what will happen with the patient access, because you improve the patient access to high-cost therapies and less money is left, for example, in my country, to increase the salary of GPs, which creates a huge access barrier. So overall, it's very difficult to understand what is the extension of the value framework, the impact on affordability and opportunity cost, and certain countries already spend 10% of their budget on orphan drugs, 10% of the drug budget on orphan drugs, which is really the minority of the patient, and still this can create, if the trending increases, then it's going to be a trade-off, and there will be an opportunity cost for such decisions. So if you move to the next slide, then I can continue with other evidence gaps and the price transparency. So many people say that we need to make sure that there are no confidential agreements. And this is actually a problem with the external price referencing. So if there are no confidential price agreements and higher income countries can reference drug prices in lower income countries, it's clearly a problem, because actually you can block patient access in lower income countries, and the problem with full transparency on pricing is that it creates also an opportunity on free ridership. I wait until everyone else makes the decision, and I want to be the lowest price across my reference countries, certainly the problem of price transparency, that until we cannot achieve that high income countries should not reference low income countries, confidential agreements in high-income countries may result in even lower prices in high-income countries compared to lower-income countries, because they have more negotiation power with pharmaceutical companies for confidential price reduction. This is the case, for example, of NICE in England. So there are a lot of uncertainties here, and again, I mentioned already the impact on transparency of development costs, and I fully agree that we should know more about the development costs, but I highlighted previously that we don't know the formula, how to translate this knowledge into local value judgment or local price limits. And then let me just highlight that if we create access to everything, what is theoretically available, then we need to manage the affordability and the sustainability of healthcare financing. And there are two ways of managing this. Either we reduce the prices, which in an international price referencing environment is very difficult, or we create access barriers, create volume limits. And if you create volume limits, then and you don't necessarily create the volume limit for the drug itself. You can create the volume limit for the diagnostic, for many things in the pathway of the patient. Then the real world health gain would be less than in a clinical trial. There will be huge inequity in access. And then in many countries, and this is the case, for example, in Eastern European countries, underpaid physicians with volume limits choose those patients who put their money into their pocket, or they are very keen on having a friendly relationship with the sales representatives of pharma companies. So the problem of volume limits is that it creates very perverse incentives and it increases corruption in the healthcare system. So let me move to the next point. I believe that we need to improve the value judgment. I believe in value-based pricing. I'm an economist, and I know how to do it correctly, even if it's not done correctly in many jurisdictions. And let me tell you that there are two very important components, is that we need to listen to patients, and we need to invite patient representatives at different levels, at macro levels, meso levels, or we need to make sure that the patient can contribute to his or her own therapeutic decisions. This is a shared decision-making process, but the patient engagement itself is not enough, because the current value judgment of health technologies is not patient-centric enough. So we measure things that are measured by physicians, efficacy, safety, maybe quality of life is the only thing which is close to patient centricity, but we are not asking patients about like how they, what is their experience with the therapy, what is their burden, the household burden, and so on and so on. So we need to improve the patient centricity of value judgment in many jurisdictions, and it doesn't necessarily mean just the engagement, but even the value criteria. And finally, let me tell you that I'm coming from a lower income European country, and in the next slide will explain that policy solutions about patient access developed to improve the accessibility of patients in high income countries just don't work in lower income countries. Partly because these countries have more limited resources, partly because their healthcare systems are more inefficient, partly because healthcare professionals have more limited compliance with clinical guidelines as a consequence of perverse incentives I described previously, partly because the regulation of pharmaceutical companies are not as strong as in other countries, partly because our politicians are also different, so there is less tradition and willingness to make transparent and evidence-informed decisions, partly because actually our great talents are moving to other countries, a brain drain of not just educated professionals, but even patient experts, and partly because we have a very inefficient patient representation in the health policy decision. It's partly related to the inappropriate funding model of patient organizations. So the reference case we saw in the Sunday Times recently about the UK system the system here is far more complicated, because our patient organizations receive zero budget from the government, and they need to survive, so they get budget from pharma for doing things, and that's actually a very inappropriate way of patient representations, and partly because when we have international policy research projects, we have limited coverage to lower income countries. So Tamás mentioned the Paradigm project. The Paradigm project is a great example. It's a fantastic project. You know how many groups were involved from Eastern Europe, the consortium? Zero. Actually, everyone in the consortium were from those countries who are doing much better. So the solutions they develop, are they transferable to our region? I'm not 100% sure. So that's the reason why the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work here. So we need to improve things everywhere, and most probably we need to have differential solutions in different jurisdictions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Zoltán, very much. That was amazing. Also because it highlighted some of the issues that we've been discussing in patient communities for years, including these differences between higher and lower income countries. And this is also something that's very close to my heart, as I'm also one of the patient experts whose drain has been drained away from our original home country to Germany. Now, do you have any immediate reflections on what we were talking about so far before we plunge into the questions and answers? And I will also check whether I can share that that particular box with you so that everybody can see the questions. But before I do that, do you have any additional points to add at this point? No, I don't seem to be able to do that.
Can you hear me, Tamás?
Yes, absolutely.
Just one thing to add, and thank you, Professor. That was a really interesting and informative presentation. I think one of the things that maybe I would take some issue with is the idea that we can't move towards transparency, because once we have transparency, we don't have a great system for determining how we would make informed or fair judgments about how pricing or payment would be managed across different countries. And I'd say I think that's I feel like you kind of, you don't know what the problem is until you don't know how to solve the problem until you figure out what the problem is. And so I think it's really important that we have transparency on that, because that's the first step in figuring out a system that is fair and appropriate, and we've got allows us to have an informed debate. So maybe that's not exactly what you're trying to say with that point, but I would say, listen, there are lots of complex issues at hand here, and I think additional information, whilst it may lead to greater complexity in how we solve these problems, I think it's an essential first step in getting to those solutions.
Actually, maybe I was not clear. I very much support any initiatives to improve the transparency on development costs. So no doubt, I just said that still it would be difficult to translate it into a magical pricing formula in local jurisdiction, but I also would like to see this data in a public domain. I do not want to, I'm not an advocate of price transparency, because if there is a full transparency, we give munition to the free riders. So those who actually would like to use this information to get the floor price, regardless what is their value, regardless whether they are richer than the reference country, regardless whether they do not have public health crisis. Like this is the case when, for example, Egypt announced what would be the price for Hep C drugs, and the next week the Forbes magazine issued a kind of editorial that US patients should get the same price as in Egypt, and in Egypt there are 15 million patients infected with Hep C. So it's a very inappropriate argument. It's a free ridership on a poor country with a public health crisis. So that's the reason why for me the price transfer is a more critical issue where actually the full price transparency may not support global equity. That's my concern.
So maybe quickly to come back on that one, and I'm sure Tracy wants to as well. I'll try to be super brief. I think there's some. I think the concept of free ridership is a really interesting one. And I think it's been incurred in the US around debates about drug pricing in the US and other countries free riding on the high prices in the US system. I say actually the evidence suggests that high prices in the US are a consequence of a failure of the US government to properly control drug prices. And that's the reason drug prices are high there. It's not because other parts of the world are not paying enough. And I think it's really dangerous because the free rider argument is being used by the pharmaceutical industry to push prices up to US levels around the world. So I think I appreciate that's not the point you make, but it is one which is being used in this debate by others. And I would also say, like, the ultimate challenge of how do we ensure we avoid inequity as a consequence of pricing transparency. I think part of that is to separate out the means by which we pay for the innovation from the price and the cost of the medicines once we've developed them. And I think that's something which maybe we'll have more time to get into in the discussion.
Right, Tracy, do you want to say something? And then I also will have this, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to. The US has a very fragmented and, as we all see now, very ineffective healthcare system. And unfortunately, the people who sought to get that medicine were poor and uninsured and had no other way to get it. And I think these things get a little lost. Like, when people hear middle income countries, sometimes people who aren't economists or don't think about it, they conflate it with middle class, although middle income countries are home to the world's poorest people. And I think real equity is when everyone has access to a medicine that they need, whether they themselves are rich or poor, and whether the country they live in is rich or poor. And that sort of, sometimes these lines we draw are really inefficient. I'll never forget giving a talk when a man said to me, yeah, I'm 60 years old and I'm sort of disabled, so no one's going to care enough about me to, you know, spend $1,000 a day on a drug. And I just said, then this is why we fight. So I think you made a lot of really interesting and very elegant points, by the way, Professor, that I appreciate a lot. But, you know, I think everything is a little more of a web and a little more complex than it sometimes seems with these country income things, especially when people must pay out of pocket, which is a case in a lot of low and middle income countries and even some upper income countries.
Right. Claire, is there anything that you would like to add at this point?
No, I mean, we've touched on some interesting topics. I think we've touched on US pricing and high prices in US. We've touched on lots of different perspectives. I think that one of the things I would say is that the examples cited, sort of rogue examples of pharmaceutical companies in HIV, I think it was, or insulin, Gilead examples. I think it makes me sad sometimes, because I think that, you know, there's obviously situations that where companies have done things and probably learnt to regret it, but it's not generalizable across the industry. I think that most people, certainly that I work with, are passionate about coming up with the right solution for patients. I also think that there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. There's a lot of negotiation with payers around pricing. It's not like companies force healthcare systems to reimburse their medicines. And we're, I mean, luckily or not, we're not in a monopoly anymore in oncology. There's thousands of companies, you know, all competing in a similar kind of disease space. So I think the important thing, though, the important point I wanted to make was about the patient advocacy partnership and the point around, you know, not getting enough funding from governments, and it is a pity. And I think a lot of these charities are dependent on fundraising as well. With COVID, it's been really severely impacted. And I think hopefully we should be able to ensure transparency around that relationship between pharma and patient advocacy organisations in a way which allows them to operate effectively in their day-to-day policy work as well. I mean, what we're doing at Janssen now is really partnering with patient advocates on research studies on, generating relevant patient evidence for dissemination or for training purposes. This is stuff that no one should be ashamed of. This is stuff that should be possible and okay to be transparent on that. So I would like to see how we can overcome that challenge. I know from, I speak a lot with my healthcare compliance person, where he's very clear on making sure that we're always doing the right thing, that we're transparent about flow of funds and what that's going to be used for. So I think I'd like us to try and see how we can make it easier to enable a partnership that doesn't compromise the activities of the patient advocacy groups.
Thank you. Is it okay if we go to the questions from the audience, because there are some really interesting ones? So if you don't mind, then I would like to plunge right into that. One of the questions that came up before the second block of statements was this: is not the core of the problem that it is difficult for the various stakeholders to align on what the value of a novel treatment is? The vision is a fair set of criteria to determine value. The reality is that these views will always differ. Next to value is affordability. A gene therapy may be valued at 4 to 5 million, whatever, euros or dollars, but is this price sustainable? So this brings, this participant brings in the issue of sustainability, something that Zoltán also referred to, and also we keep revolving around value, transparency, and equity. Anyone can start if you want to come back to this question at all.
I believe really the question is whether since the HCV sofosbuvir case indicated that it's not enough to think about just whether the price is fair in certain jurisdiction of the therapy, and for a curative therapy, I think the problem was not with the price, but with the affordability, because for curing that many patients, the Hep C patients, for many healthcare systems, actually it was a mission impossible to make the drug available for everyone. But although the cost effectiveness studies said that this is not the drug was cost effective even in the United States with that price. So I have to say that we need to improve the criteria how we make decisions, and we need to make sure that we've got some consistency, and most probably because of the curative therapies, the gene therapies, we need to pay much more attention to affordability. Previously, many countries just looked at the cost effectiveness, the high income countries, and didn't pay that much attention to affordability. But now, actually, with the orphan drugs, affordability becomes an issue with the curative gene therapies, with the Hep C case, of course. So currently, there is a shift to create a new kind of judgment, which will be based on multiple criteria in many jurisdictions. And even those countries who were very stubborn not to pay attention to budget impact analysis now have budget impact criteria, and that will change the rules of the ball game.
Yeah, I think it's, I fully agree. And yes. I think, what I would add is that when a gene therapy, something of a price tag of what was cited, 5 million or something very high, clearly if it meets the cost effectiveness threshold, that's been shown to obviously reduce the cost of subsequent treatment such that it makes sense, right, to make a positive reimbursement recommendation. I think when it goes to sustainability, I think that most payers would really struggle with paying upfront $5 million, euros, for a load of patients in one financial year. So in terms of how I consider sustainability, it's about payment models, you know, that perhaps are spread over time, like a mortgage or something to that ilk, where it becomes sustainable because you're reducing these upfront treatment costs. But I think that if, for example, a child gets a gene therapy and it saves a lifetime of very expensive time in hospital and subsequent treatments, it could make sense that such a treatment has value at that price tag. I think the sustainability, though, just relates to the solution in how you pay for it. And I think that's where you can, and that's where access is possible, by coming forward with those different options for spreading payment over time, or in fact, you know, giving a discount or a rebate if a patient doesn't respond as expected.
I just come back on that if I can, Thomas, and thank you, Claire and Professor. It kind of scares the bejesus out of me for us to be talking about setting up mortgage-style payments to cover the cost of drugs long into the future, because it is going to place our future healthcare system in a never-ending, like, you buy one house in your lifetime. That's not the way this works. We're going to be constantly paying for these ever high prices. And if we unblock the problem of the affordability of these drugs in the short term by agreeing that we'll cover the costs for years to come, then we are not going to ever bring the price tags under control. And I think whenever you're talking about affordability of or value of a new innovative treatment, like, for example, CAR-T therapy, we have to be able to talk about what it costs to do that in other alternative business models. We know that in the Spanish health system, they've developed their own version of CAR-T therapy in public hospitals. That's a fraction of the price of the CAR-T therapies being developed by the profit-seeking pharmaceutical corporations. We need to be talking about that whenever we're determining whether or not a price is fair for these innovative products. And if we can do it much more cheaply, for better outcomes for more patients in other ways, then we shouldn't be shying away from that conversation. I don't think we should be continuing to double down on a pricing model, because actually it is what's required by the pharmaceutical industry to satisfy their short-term demands in terms of shareholder dividend payments and share price growth, which is what is actually driving an awful lot of the pricing decisions within companies. And that's not just about high prices for new medicines, it's about increasing the prices of old medicines, which we're seeing continuously in many markets around the world.
I think
for me, the question, but for me, the question remains, and then I let you speak, Tracy, sorry, is that, okay, but what is it that patient communities can do in order to influence this conversation? I mean, beyond organizing several more such events. Tracy, you go ahead.
I think really beginning to advocate first for transparency, not only about the development cost, but a lot of these therapies were developed initially at a higher risk stage with taxpayer money. So people wind up paying for them 2 or 3 times, not just the once when they need them. And I think really saying we want to operate from a place of transparency. As Dearman said, really working in solidarity. This isn't just about getting one drug for one group. It's really looking at drugs across different disease states so that people have access to what they need. And I find the value conversation honestly really problematic, because it's almost like saying a person's life is worth this much, or will save this much on keeping you alive, in the absence of a more holistic way of looking at how drugs are developed and who contributes to their development. And it can sort of shield that we're talking about profit-generating entities answering to shareholders from real things that affect people in their lives every day. And I think really sort of pushing back a little bit. I remember a discussion I heard where Gilead was saying that sofosbuvir was a great deal because it costs less than a liver transplant, as if everyone who needed one had access to one. And even if there was this endless supply of donor livers, as if people could afford the procedure, as if the hospitals had enough capacity to do, hundreds of thousands. We're talking about something that 71 million people have been living with. So I think maybe it's time to just be a little more blunt about how do we separate good health outcomes for everyone that are affordable from the for-profit world, keep the engine going so more new drugs can be developed, but not so the train is running over people.
I'm sorry, but we have so many questions that I really need to go on, and I would like to ask you to keep your responses kind of short. So one of the questions is here, which then comes back again in another question. It says if we are to achieve more access in lower income countries, then we need tiered pricing with lower prices in the lower and middle income countries. To achieve that, we need net prices to remain. Do we need net prices to remain confidential? Should the drive for transparency relate to better understanding how these decisions are made? And it continues reimbursement processes and so on, rather than just the net price. So should transparency cover the entire spectrum? What do you think about that?
Maybe if I could kick off, thanks, Tomas. Just to say, I think there's been a lot of research around the efficacy of tiered pricing in terms of driving affordability across different parts of the world with different socioeconomic rates of development. And actually the evidence is that it's not a particularly effective means of dropping prices to something where patients can get affordable access. Some of the research done by Suri Moon and others has shown that actually in reality, you have far better price reductions by using other means, including voluntary and compulsory licensing, which facilitate generic competition to reduce the prices in that way. What you also see when some of the research which has been done, which has showed that the tiered pricing, which has been used by pharmaceutical companies, actually ends up leading to higher prices in markets which have got a lower socioeconomic development level, but also lower rates of relative negotiating power. And so those countries where, including North African countries, were paying higher prices than Western European countries were paying for the same product. And so often tiered pricing, whilst it's kind of promoted as a means of cutting prices for low-income countries or lower-income countries, actually often it's used as a revenue maximizing strategy by the pharmaceutical industry, where they're able to differentially price and not necessarily lower where the income rates are lower.
Any other takes on this?
I guess in my experience, I haven't seen that. I don't have that experience in my own organisation. We set our own tiers, right? And it seems to work quite well. So I think it's fair that lower income countries pay lower prices. And yeah, I don't see it as a system that's not working. I think where it's challenging is where you have high income countries who use very stringent criteria to try and get the lowest price. And we've had challenges, countries like the UK, where, very kind of strict use of HTA criteria, where, they're wanting to pay the lowest common denominator, where that, there isn't that, this definition of value, I think, is quite restrictive to just a cost per quality calculation. But in my experience, tier pricing is effective, and I think it's good to be transparent as an industry. But I don't see any value in having transparency around net pricing, where you're offering a good price that's appropriate for a country. Because as Professor Zoltan was mentioning, you get the highest income countries wanting to pay the lowest price, and it distorts the model. And I think so that's an important point to make. I would say everybody benefits from having transparency around net pricing.
Just to really quickly come back on that, Claire, if you look at, if you see the if you think that tiered pricing is working within your company, and you look at the differential rates of access to your products across low, middle, and higher income countries, I think we look at oncology access across the developing world. The rates of cancer patients getting fair access to treatment at affordable prices, they're vanishingly small. Tiered pricing is not a solution which is successfully working for patients across the developing world.
I love you all to bits, but we're not here to solve this today. We are here to discuss where the problems are and how patients can do more or make a bigger or a more meaningful input into this debate. Actually, there's a simple one coming up here, which is, do you have any information about which EU countries have the most restrictive medicines price policy? I have no idea. Or maybe you have a reference where this can be looked up. I don't even quite understand what is restrictive medicines price policy.
Actually, there is no simple answer for this question, because let's say if you reference countries who's got very restrictive medicines price policy, you can have a very simple price policy and you are still very restrictive, because you are referencing the countries which have the most restrictive price policy. So the problem again here is the free ridership issue, and certainly what I really feel that there are many countries who try to improve their patient access by being very creative and very complex, which cannot be referenced easily. And then at the end of the day, you call it very restrictive because of the complexity. But that's the reason why things are not so simple. Actually, just listening the stories can be, I would like to clearly differentiate patented and off-patent products. And I was raised in a communist country where intellectual property was not respected. For-profit companies were equal with the devils, and I do not want those days come back, because actually we had shortages everywhere, no good quality products, and so on and so on. So I'm sorry, if until the industry model is based on or rewarded, the investment is rewarded with patent protection, we have to respect that countries keep the patent protection for all of their products, including pharmaceuticals. And then we need to think about how we can improve the system, but maybe we can challenge the IP, but at the moment I don't know which gives better incentives for making the investment to find new technologies for patients.
Right, now the next one actually goes to Dermot, but it's probably for everyone after all, which is what do you think would be an acceptable profit for pharmaceutical companies? That's a hard one.
Yeah, I guess it is. I think so. I think one of the things to start off with by saying is the pharmaceutical industry profitability rates are amongst the highest of any industrial sector. If you look across at oil and gas, or you look at agriculture, or you look at many other industrial sectors, transportation and other areas, the rates of profitability amongst the pharmaceutical industry are amongst the highest of any industrial sector. And whenever that kind of profit comes along with patients dying without access to medicines that are priced out of their reach, then we need to ask the question whether or not we find that rate of profitability acceptable or not. And so I think it is difficult to determine what a fair profit is, but I think you start by doing that by having a transparent understanding of how much profit is being made, how much costs are being incurred, and what price is being paid for each medicine. And when you have that, you're able to make slightly more informed decisions about what a profitable what a profitable price is. And so one of the things I would say is that's challenging to do, but I'm not like a complete communist, despite what maybe some people on the call might think. Like, I actually think there's real value to be had in the market and in creating competition between firms. I think one of the things which makes it very difficult for fairness to be calculated in the market at the moment is the kind of the abstraction of that market through monopolies. And what you actually see is that these medicines, once they've been developed, can be produced generically, where companies engage in competition to secure market share, and they're able to both price their products at a rate which is affordable for patients and healthcare systems, whilst also making a return on their investments. And so I think we need to think about what are the structures within the wider within the wider pharmaceutical industry innovation model that would allow us to move towards greater levels of competition, and separating out that kind of production of the medicines and a fair pricing of the medicines from the investment that we need to make upfront to develop them in the first place.
Let me just contribute what science says, because you missed the two factors.
Claire started to. Sorry, Zoltan. Claire started to reply. I'm sorry.
Of course.
So, Zoltan, can you then take it back?
Two factors that you missed, and from behavioral economics. So, if you consider investors, where to invest, beyond the factors you listed, you take into account two other factors: the risk of investment and the time to return. And actually, the pharmaceutical investment is a risky investment, and the time to return is relatively slow. So if you invest into development of a drug today, until you get your profit, you need to wait many years. And then that's the reason why actually investors have an expectation to have a higher profit in the pharma industry. Otherwise, they move to other places to make their investment. So this is something to factor in and to take into account what is the fair profit for risky business where the time to return is longer.
I would just like to say one thing in the meantime while we're waiting for Claire to get her volume back so we can hear what she has to contribute. That one thing patients can do is find an easy to read, clear source of information on intellectual property and access barriers and what the different pathways to access are for medicines. Because some of the things we're talking about, we're using a lot of coded language that we all understand, but a lot of people don't. And I have to personally say, like, I follow drug development, I follow trials. I don't need to know about that IP stuff. That's for other people. Until the time came when I really did need to learn it to do my job well. And if I can learn it, anyone can learn it, and it will add a different level to this dialogue. It's sort of like learning a different language or learning how to cook something instead of heating up the leftovers and saying, oh, this is really good and I'm enjoying it, but I'd like to have it more.
Claire, you're back.
Yeah.
Let's give it a try.
Yay! Hey, great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry about that. Technology, what can you do? Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the point about the profitability of the pharmaceutical industry relative to other sectors, because I have some data that I'm quite happy to share. And actually, it's not as extreme as it sounds. So at the top of the graph, you've got real estate companies, investment and asset management, utility companies making the largest profits across different sectors, followed by renewable and green energy, then tobacco. Then the pharmaceutical industry features around 7th on the list, and biotech companies even further down, around 12% pre-tax unadjusted operating margin. So I'm very happy to share some figures around that, just to make it transparent, you know, and put it into perspective in the other sectors, because I think it's really important that we have that information out there. So I'm happy to share that off after this call today.
I think that would be a very good. That would be very good. Also because clearly there's a need for more information, as Tracy hinted to it, and also this is what I conclude from many of the questions, that it would probably do good. And some of the patient organizations like Dermot's Just Treatment, but also the European AIDS Treatment Group, where I used to be there as a member working on access and affordability. We even have a whole training module about this. I wrote a book on this, so maybe it would make sense to provide all of that information to the patient communities, partly through the European Patients Academy and partly through some other repositories. So this is something that's a takeaway for us, the organizers of this session, that maybe it would make sense ultimately to start developing such a knowledge base for all patients and patient organizations to learn from. So thank you very much, Tracy, for that. Yes, Dermot?
Yeah, just to add, thank you, Tomas. Just to say, I think some of the, I think there's really interesting data out there, and I've got some other numbers, but I think one of the other things that might be useful for people to look at as well is the work of Bill Lazonik, who is an economist, looking at basically the kind of, I suppose you would argue, the financialization of the pharmaceutical industry over the last 20 to 30 years, and looking at the amount of money that's coming out from healthcare systems and from patients and going into shareholders, both in terms of share buybacks, which inflate the prices of pharmaceutical companies, and also share dividend payments. And so that's, I think, a really other interesting piece of analysis, which is going to be really useful to inform the debate about the financial practices of the industry.
So that information or reference can become part of such a knowledge base. And actually that already also answers one of the questions, which is about the relationship of the pharmaceutical industry and the finance sector. So I will take that off the list. Several people in the conversation confirmed the importance of transparency, and I think that that's been discussed quite extensively, and also equity. So I will take those off the list as well. And let me see what else is here. There's an interesting point, which is about the taxpayer myth, which one of the participants says should be cleared. Can you make a quick statement on that? Because this participant wants to see facts put next to this, what they call the taxpayer myth.
I can go back and look at some of the reporting that I relied on when I worked for MSF, because there are some reports about just the amount of money, at least in the US, that taxpayers spent per year financing mostly preclinical and phase 1 development, where the risk of loss is the greatest, and then companies took over things. But I mean, one living example right now is what's happening with the COVID vaccines, where the US government has already given $10 billion to pharmaceutical companies, and some of their executives are selling their stock at very high prices and making millions of dollars in profits for themselves based on report outs that the vaccines look good. And Moderna in particular may be getting sued because they share the intellectual property for their vaccine with the US National Institutes of Health. So also a good Google search will help you find this stuff. It's not really that obscure. Right. You just have to have the interest in ferreting it out. Thank you.
Right.
Let me contribute to the public incentives made to the development of orphan drugs. Sometimes it's financial support, sometimes it's waivers, sometimes it's other type of incentive. Also, let me also use the Innovative Medicines Initiative, in which European taxpayers' money is used to co-finance the development of new medicines. And really, it's a very important point that, for example, from the Eastern European countries' perspective, so if public money is utilized to develop new drugs, there should be equity in the access to those medicines across European countries. So they shouldn't be just made available in a higher income part of Europe when all European taxpayers contributed to the development of these drugs. So certainly there is some good evidence that actually public incentives and even public money is used to support drug development in certain areas.
Thank you. Actually, we are in the last 4 minutes of our session today. I mean, I can clearly see that we could go on for another hour easily. What is as a closing statement or point? How do you think that patients and patient communities then can ultimately contribute to better access through affordability? Because that's the original title or topic for today's session. A quick statement from each of you. Anyone can start?
I think I'm happy to start with saying that I think having the same information is helpful. So having transparency around regulatory approvals, HTA approvals, having the right facts and figures, I think would be very helpful, because I think there's lots of myths and anecdotes. And I think if we can all come from the same fact base, I think that would be super helpful. But I guess the important thing for me is just the continued collaboration, the continued debate and dialogue. And it's good that we have different perspectives, but I think just having the discussion is super, and we should really continue that at every opportunity.
Well, you might get invited to another one, so careful with that statement. Who's next?
I can continue. Beyond the increased public information and transparency, I certainly would like to pay attention to global consequences of local actions and especially their impact on equity. Also that if we would like to have patient-centric healthcare systems, we need to understand how patients value is what you get, price is what you pay. So how they think about the value, and we need to educate patients and we need to engage patients. So there are many components of a patient-centric healthcare system, and we need to improve on all of these components.
And maybe I'd like Tracy to have the last word. I'll go next to say, first of all, thanks so much. I think it's been a really fruitful discussion. I'd echo one of the things Tracy said earlier about the need for everybody involved in this work to educate themselves around some of the key tenets of intellectual property rights in particular, because I think that's really fundamental in how the innovation model works and the consequences for prices and access. I'd also say it's great that EUPATI are doing more on this, because I think it's really, really important. And I would say to people that are listening from within patient organizations, either they themselves are patients or they work for them, I'd really ask you to encourage your organization to think more broadly about some of the systemic drivers of the challenges we're seeing around access and affordability. It's not just about the fact that an individual company has chosen to price a single drug at a high rate that makes it challenging for the payers in that country. We really need to, we can't have cancer organizations only worrying about cancer drugs, and we can't have Hep C organizations only worrying about Hep C. We need to have solidarity across patient organizations and to start looking at some of those bigger drivers of the problems we're facing. I think one example of that is, the level of involvement of patient groups, for example, in advocacy around free trade agreements. The US government has been negotiating significant, and the European Union have been negotiating significant trade agreements with countries around the world. And within that, imposing additional restrictions that will lead to higher prices of medicines in those countries. And that's happening to the UK at the moment in the negotiations between the US and the UK around a free trade agreement. It will happen to other European countries, and it will be exported from Europe to other parts of the world. So from everything I've seen, there's been a very low level of patient organization involvement in those kinds of debates. I think that's just one example of a forum where we need to be more present and we need to be more vocal about the consequences of the actions our governments are taking, often under pressure from the pharmaceutical industry.
Right, Tracy?
I would reiterate, ask for transparency, learn your stuff, and use your voice. Patients have more power than they realize. Policymakers will listen and work in solidarity.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, well, we at EUPATI, we are patient academy. So what we can do best is teach and spread knowledge, spread information. And that's what we are committed to, and that's what we promise to do. So thank you very much for all of you for being here and bringing in your stuff. Plenty of juice. That was really exciting. And I also learned a lot. So thank you very much for that. And to all participants, thank you for patiently listening to us. The recording will be uploaded to the EUPATI YouTube channel and also to the Patient Engagement Open Forum website. So you can rewatch the whole session if you so like. Thank you and goodbye.